fist of foes. Cobra. Joes will risk it all to end the evil call of Cobra. They never give up, they never say die. Walking tall with banners high, they sound the battle cry. There's trouble over land and sea and air. G.I. Joe is there.
G.I. Joe is the code name for America's daring, highly trained Special Mission Force. Its purpose, to defend human freedom against Cobra, a ruthless terrorist organization determined to rule the world.
G.I. Joe, G.I. Joe, G.I. Joe. For freedom, wherever there's trouble over land and sea and air.
Cobra! Retreat! Retreat!
G.I. Joe! G.I. Joe is there! G.I. Joe!
Wherever there's trouble, G.I. Joe is there. G.I. Joe, real American hero. G.I. Joe is there. It's G.I. Joe against Cobra and Destro, fighting to save the day. He never gives up, he's always there, fighting for freedom over land and air. G.I. Joe, real American hero. G.I. Joe is there.
G.I. Joe is the code name for America's daring, highly trained Special Mission Force. Its purpose, to defend human freedom against Cobra, a ruthless terrorist organization determined to rule the world.
He never gives up, he'll stay till the fight's won. G.I. Joe will dare. G.I. Joe, American hero. G.I. Joe. Wherever there's trouble, G.I. Joe is there. G.I. Joe, G.I. Joe is there. It's G.I. Joe against Cobra, the enemy, fighting to save the day. He never gives up, he's always there, fighting for freedom over land and air. G.I. Joe, G.I. Joe is there.
G.I. Joe is the code name for America's daring, highly trained Special Mission Force. Its purpose, to defend human freedom against Cobra, a ruthless terrorist organization determined to rule the world.
He never gives up, he'll stay till the fight's won. G.I. Joe will dare. G.I. Joe, G.I. Joe. Up. He's always there, fighting for freedom over land and air. G.I. Joe.
G.I. Joe is the code name for America's daring, highly trained Special Mission Force. Its purpose, to defend human freedom against Cobra, a ruthless terrorist organization determined to rule the world.
He never gives up, he'll stay till the fight's won. G.I. Joe. fight for freedom wherever there's trouble. G.I. Joe is there. G.I. Joe, American hero. G.I. Joe is there. It's G.I. Joe against Cobra, the enemy, fighting to save the day. He never gives up, he's always there, fighting for freedom over land and air. G.I. Joe, American hero. G.I. Joe is there.
G.I. Joe is the code name for America's daring, highly trained Special Mission Force. Its purpose? To defend human freedom against Cobra, a ruthless terrorist organization determined to rule the world.
He never gives up, he'll stay till the fight's won. G.I. Joe will dare. G.I. Joe, G.I. Joe.
The sky comes a fearful cry. Cobra, Cobra, Cobra. Armies of the night, evil taking flight. Cobra, Cobra, Cobra. Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Panic spreading far and wide. Who can turn the tide? G.I. Joe, American hero. G.I. Joe, there. G.I. Joe, American hero. G.I. Joe is there, fighting for freedom wherever there's trouble over land and sea and air. G.I. Joe is there. Can the world oppose the deadliest of foes? Cobra, Cobra, Cobra. Joes will risk it all to end the evil call of Cobra, Cobra. They never give up, they never say die. Walking tall with banners high, they sound the battle cry. G.I. Joe, American hero. G.I. Joe there. G.I. Joe, American hero. G.I. Joe is there, fighting for freedom wherever there's trouble over land and sea and air. G.I. Joe is there.
G.I. Joe is the code name for America's daring, highly trained Special Mission Force. Its purpose? To defend human freedom against Cobra, a ruthless terrorist organization determined to rule the world.
G.I. Joe, American hero. G.I. Joe there. G.I. Joe, American hero. G.I. Joe there, fighting for freedom wherever there's trouble over land and sea and air.
Retreat! Retreat!
G.I. Joe, American hero. G.I. Joe is there. G.I. Joe.
G.I. Joe is the code name for America's daring, highly trained Special Mission Force. Its purpose? To defend human freedom against Cobra, a ruthless terrorist organization determined to rule the world.
Yo, Joe! We'll fight for freedom wherever there's trouble. G.I. Joe is there. G.I. Joe, American G.I. Joe against Cobra and Destro, fighting to save the day. He never gives up, he's always there, fighting for freedom over land and air. G.I. Joe, American hero, G.I. Joe is there.
G.I. Joe is the code name for America's daring, highly trained Special Mission Force. Its purpose, to defend human freedom against Cobra, a ruthless terrorist organization determined to rule the world.
He never gives up, he'll stay till the fight's won. G.I. Joe will dare. G.I. Joe, American hero, G.I. Joe. Wherever there's trouble, G.I. Joe is there. G.I. Joe, G.I. Joe is there. It's G.I. Joe against Cobra, the enemy, fighting to save the day. He never gives up, he's always there, fighting for freedom over land and air. G.I. Joe, G.I. Joe is there.
G.I. Joe is the code name for America's daring, highly trained Special Mission Force. Its purpose, to defend human freedom against Cobra, a ruthless terrorist organization determined to rule the world.
He never gives up, he'll stay till the fight's won. G.I. Joe will dare. G.I. Joe, G.I. Joe. Wherever there's trouble, G.I. Joe is there. G.I. Joe against Cobra, the enemy, fighting to save the day. He never gives up, he's always there, fighting for freedom over land and air. G.I. Joe,
G.I. Joe is the code name for America's daring, highly trained Special Mission Force. Its purpose, to defend human freedom against Cobra, a ruthless terrorist organization determined to rule the world.
He never gives up, he'll stay till the fight's won. G.I. Joe will dare. G.I. Joe, American hero, G.I. Joe.
Yo, Joe!
He'll fight for freedom wherever there's trouble. G.I. Joe is there. G.I. Joe, American hero, G.I. Joe is there. It's G.I. Joe against Cobra, the enemy, fighting to save the day. He never gives up, he's always there, fighting for freedom over land and air. G.I. Joe, American hero, G.I. Joe is there.
G.I. Joe is the code name for America's daring, highly trained Special Mission Force. Its purpose, to defend human freedom against Cobra, a ruthless terrorist organization determined to rule the world.
He never gives up, he'll stay till the fight's won. G.I. Joe will dare. G.I. Joe, G.I. Joe.
Crashing through the sky comes a fearful cry. Cobra, Cobra, Cobra. Armies of the night, evil taking flight. Cobra, Cobra, Cobra. Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Panic spreading far and wide. Who can turn the tide?
G.I. Joe, American hero. Yo, G.I. Joe, there. G.I. Joe, American hero. G.I. Joe is there, fighting for freedom wherever there's trouble over land and sea and air.
when the evil call of Cobra. They never give up, they never say die. Walking tall with banners high, they sound the battle cry. G.I. Joe, G.I. Joe there, G.I. Joe, G.I. Joe is there, fighting for freedom wherever there's trouble over land and sea and air. G.I. Joe is there.
G.I. Joe is the code name for America's daring, highly trained Special Mission Force. Its purpose, to defend human freedom against Cobra, a ruthless terrorist organization determined to rule the world.
G.I. Joe, G.I. Joe there, G.I. Joe, G.I. Joe there, fighting for freedom wherever there's trouble over land and sea and air.
Retreat! Retreat!
G.I. Joe, G.I. Joe is there, G.I. Joe.
Yo, Joe! They'll fight for freedom wherever there's trouble. G.I. Joe is there. G.I. Joe! International heroes. G.I. Joe is there. G.I. Joe against the ruthless enemy, fighting to save the day. They never give up. They're always there, fighting for freedom over land and air. G.I. Joe! International heroes. G.I. Joe is there.
G.I. Joe is the code name for an international, highly trained Special Mission Force. Its purpose, to defend human freedom against a ruthless terrorist organization determined to rule the world.
They never give up, they'll stay till the fight's won. G.I. Joe will dare. G.I. Joe! International heroes. G.I. Joe!
Got to get tough, yo, Joe. Got to get tough, yo, Joe. You know you got to stand tall when it comes down to the wire. You got to play rough when you cross that line of fire. You got to have guts to stand for your rights. You got to keep a grip enough to hold on tight. You got to do the fighting with all of your might. You got to keep the target straight ahead in your sights. Got to get tough, yo, Joe. Got to get tough, yo, Joe. G.I. Joe, America's top secret mobile strike force team. Yo, Joe. The mission, to defend freedom. Yo, Joe. The threat, Cobra, an evil organization bent on world conquest. Yo, Joe. The battle cry, yo, Joe. Got to get tough, yo, Joe. Got to get tough, yo, Joe.
Surrounded on all sides, the odds of survival are 1,000,000 to 1.
G.I. Joe street.
And with the collapse of the former superpower,
Several powerful factions now vie for control.
the threat is real. An evil organization calling itself SCAR.
Only as SCAR.
Their goal, nothing short of total world domination. Led by this man, known only as Iron Claw.
We will be victorious. Not on my watch. G.I. Joe street.
Situation critical.
Roll call.
Ballistic. Harpoon. Mayday. Black Dragon.
Sergeant Savage.
Greek Steak. Metalhead. Right.
Lieutenant Stone.
The odds are 1,000,000 to 1.
And that's the way we like it. G.I. Joe street. Joe Sigma 6, code name for a highly trained special mission force. Its objective, stop Cobra, stop Cobra. Sigma 6, be a hero. G.I. Joe will turn the tide. Be a hero. Sigma 6 is on your side. Be a hero. Be the best of the best. Whenever there's a mission, G.I. Joe is there. Sigma man, heavy duty on the scene. Snake guys hand to hand, long range, lean and mean. Scarlet, ready to fight. Turbo red ignite. Wherever Cobra strikes, wherever they attack, G.I. Joe will fight. There's no turning back. Yo, Joe! Be a hero! G.I. Joe will turn the tide! Be a hero! Sigma 6 is on your side, be a hero! Be the best of the best! Whenever there's a mission, G.I. Joe is there. Sigma 6!
Prep for action. Communication is reacquired.
All games end today.
Accused of a crime they didn't commit, a ragtag band of fugitives fights a covert battle to clear their names and expose the insidious enemy that is Cobra. Some call them outlaws. Some call them heroes. But these determined men and women think of themselves only as ordinary Joes. And this is their story.
Say the name G.I. Joe to a Gen Xer, and the casual fan will probably yell, "Yo, Joe!" and then rattle off names like Duke, Flint, Lady J, and Shipwreck.
I'd rather save yours.
God, I hate Shipwreck. It makes sense. For most people, G.I. Joe is defined by the Sunbow cartoon. And that's a shame, because contrary to what many know, G.I. Joe didn't start with Duke, or Roadblock, or Destro. G.I. Joe's relaunch as a real American hero started in 1982 with a stellar comic book by Larry Hama that had a completely different continuity from the cartoon and lasted years beyond it. It all started with 13 soldiers whose design evoked the look and feel of the U.S. Army in the 1980s. Dark green, Army uniforms, fairly realistic weapons. It reminds you of films like Red Dawn or First Blood or even Tank. I'm continually surprised that a lot of people and fans of G.I. Joe from my generation have never heard of these characters. So allow me to introduce you to the first 13 members of G.I. Joe. Clayton Abernathy, Denver, Colorado, codename Hawk. West Point graduate, top of his class. The original leader of G.I. Joe wasn't Duke, it was Hawk. Now you might think that you know who Hawk is because you've seen the G.I. Joe movie. That's actually a promoted version of the original Hawk character. That's the general. Hawk in the original 13 was a lower ranking officer, but he was still the head of the original pantheon of G.I. Joes. The cool thing about Hawk was that he didn't come on a card. He came with the mobile missile system, which was this massive ground-to-air strike missile tripod with a fold-out computer. He stood beside it authoritatively and, I guess, dealt out death, or used it to get the other Joes to follow his orders. Alvin Kibbe, Gatlinburg, Tennessee. Codename Breaker. Communications officer and expert in covert electronics. Breaker is an interesting character in the original 13 Joes. You probably saw him all the time on the cartoon, but didn't realize that he was one of the original 13 members of the toy line. Breaker is generally depicted in the cartoon with a gray uniform, and he's always at the communication station with his headset on. But Breaker was cool because, like the rest of the 13 Joes, he had a real function that the military would have in an infantry squad. He was the radio guy. So Breaker is actually a useful addition to G.I. Joe for those realistic missions. Lonzo Wilkinson, Detroit, Michigan. Codename Stalker. Former gang leader, fluent in 5 languages. By today's standards, Stalker would be classified as the token black guy in G.I. Joe. But at the time the original 13 members came out, Stalker had a useful function as the second-in-command to Hawk. Stalker was the point man on their missions, while Hawk stayed back and gave out the orders. Stalker actually served a big role in the original animated miniseries as well, The Mass Device. He was one of the most active members of the group at that point. So Stalker got lucky because he was a strong character in the beginning of G.I. Joe's comic book series, and he was a strong character in the beginning of G.I. Joe's animated series, which was rare. Robert Graves, Columbus, Ohio. Codename Grunt. Straight up soldier, cool under fire. I've known more than a few collectors and G.I. Joe fans who think that Grunt is just a troop builder figure, like a stormtrooper or a Cobra enemy. But in reality, in the comic book, Grunt was a specific character with a real personality. Larry Hama actually wrote into the comic book series later that Grunt was discharged from G.I. Joe honorably and then went off to finish college. He was a fleshed-out, three-dimensional human being, but for most people, Grunt is just a generic army soldier. He's got the M16 and the Musette bag. He looks like a background character in a Vietnam movie. So I guess depending on what your priorities are, you can see Grunt as either a unique individual or you can just see him as background fodder for your toy collection. Ralph Pulaski, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Codename Steeler. Comes from a blue-collar family. Driver of the Mobat. Unlike the Star Wars toy line from Kenner, G.I. Joe actually included pilots and drivers with their vehicles, which was really cool. Steeler is one of the most famous original drivers. If you were lucky enough to get Steeler, then that means you got the Mobat tank with him, and you were one lucky kid. The Mobat's sitting behind me right now, and it's easily the coolest tank Hasbro ever made for G.I. Joe. The thing was motorized, it had rubber treads, it could drive over anything. Books, blankets, your pets. James Barney, Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin. Codename Grand Slam. Sci-fi and comic book junkie. Operator, Jump Jetpack. Grand Slam is an interesting member of the G.I. Joe team because he's one of the only characters that was visibly changed from the 1982 straight arm versions into the 1983 swivel arm versions. Originally, Grand Slam had these red protective pads all over his uniform, and he came with a large artillery cannon. But in 1983, they changed it so that he had these silver pads and a visored helmet, and he came with the Jump Jetpack, which is arguably a lot cooler. Mark Brenston, Chicago, Illinois. Codename Short Fuse. Comes from a military family. Certified math genius. I wish I had something cool to say about Short Fuse. He's not a bad character. As a matter of fact, what makes him great is that he fills another traditional role in an infantry squad. He's the mortar and artillery soldier. Again, very realistic roles for these characters up front, not caricatures at all. Short Fuse had a strong role in the beginning of the comic book series, but like so many of the original 13, he was slowly pushed off to the sidelines as Hasbro introduced new figures. Lance Steinberg, Asbury Park, New Jersey. Codename Clutch. Street racer. Greases his hair with motor oil. Chews on the same toothpick for months. Clutch is one of my favorite G.I. Joes because he was my first G.I. Joe figure. And because he was a driver, he came with the Vamp Jeep, which had the big machine gun on the back. Clutch didn't have as prominent a role in the cartoon after it got going, but in the comic book, he was always a strong character and tended to evolve. Larry Hama paid a lot of attention to him. His second incarnation, he became the driver of the Vamp Mark II, which was the desert version of the Jeep, which was really cool because it had doors and a roof, and it had a missile launcher on the back. Rafael Melendez, New York City, New York. Codename Zap. Bazooka Soldier, Demolitions Expert. Zap is the G.I. Joe Bazooka Soldier, not to be confused with Zap Brannigan from Futurama or Zap Rousdower from The Final Sacrifice. Zap is cool because not only did he come with this massive bazooka weapon, Zap is also interesting in hindsight because Zap is Hispanic. And I like the fact that he's not a caricature. Like everybody else in the original 13, he wears the same standard uniform they do, and they're all equal. I think that's really cool. I think it speaks to something that was really progressive that was going on with G.I. Joe at that time that quickly just got dumbed down, and then we ended up with characters that were visibly different from one another racially. And I'm not trying to put political correctness into this video at all. I'm just saying that as far as subtlety and a deft hand for design goes, and Larry Hama's writing, Zap is a much more interesting and enriching character to G.I. Joe than the ones that came after him. Anthony Gambello, Lodi, California. Codename Flash. Electronics expert. Laser rifle operator. Flash is my absolute favorite G.I. Joe of all time. Not just of the original 13 members, but of all the G.I. Joes. He wasn't used very much, which is a shame because he's really cool, but I will say he's in the intro of the original cartoon miniseries of each episode, which I think is awesome. And in the comic book, he was used pretty strongly up front, not as strongly as a lot of the other characters, and then he slowly sort of petered out like the rest of them did. I think the reason I liked Flash so much was not just because he was one of my first G.I. Joes, and I know that has a lot to do with it, but because he just looked so unique. He had the red protective pads like Grand Slam and the visored helmet, but he also had this cool backpack with a laser rifle attached to it via cable. Craig McConnell, Malibu, California. Codename, Rock and Roll. Surfer, weightlifter, guitarist, machine gunner. I remember when I was a little kid and G.I. Joe had first come out that Rock and Roll was one of the most popular action figures for kids to get because he was the machine gunner. He had the 2 bullet bandoliers crosswise over his chest, and he came with a massive bipod machine gun, and he was always seen riding around on the Ram motorcycle. He had the blonde beard, and he was the surfer guy. Rock and Roll was one of the most memorable of the original 13 Joes for kids who remember them on the toy aisles. Shayna O'Hara, Atlanta, Georgia. Codename Scarlet. Martial arts prodigy, earned her first black belt at 15. Scarlet is probably one of those characters you think you know because you've seen the cartoon. She's the redhead with the ponytail and the crossbow. But if you don't know the original 13 Joes and you don't know Larry Hama's comic book, you probably don't know much about Scarlet at all. Now, in the cartoon, Scarlet was depicted as having a relationship with Duke, sort of a sophomoric romance type of relationship. But in the comic book, it was never that way. Scarlet's core relationship was with Snake Eyes, and that was the central dramatic direction of the comic book throughout its whole run. Scarlet always maintained her identity apart from Snake Eyes, despite the fact that she was his girlfriend. Scarlet is a strong, fearless character. She has just immovable conviction, and the courage that she exhibits in the comic book is, to say the least, incredible. A lot of people remember Snake Eyes as having a wolf companion named Timber, but that's not actually Snake Eyes' first incarnation. His first role was as a demolitions and espionage commando. He didn't have a sword, he wasn't a ninja, he did know 12 martial arts, but I think he was a lot cooler because he was more unique. The 1980s was the ninja craze, but Snake Eyes wasn't, by definition, a ninja at that point. He became a rival for Storm Shadow later in the comic book, and in the cartoon, he frankly got shoved off to the side because he didn't speak. In the comic book, on the other hand, because it's a still visual medium, Snake Eyes was perfect and he quickly rose to the top. They actually devoted an entire issue to him, issue number 21, which is famous because there's no dialogue, and it's one of the best G.I. Joe issues ever written. I liked these guys a lot because they weren't the caricatures that came soon afterward, and they were some of my first Joes. I find these 13 characters to be more interesting than their successors.
It's here, the G.I. Joe collection. Infantry Trooper, codename Grunt. Bazooka Soldier, codename Zap. Motor Soldier, codename Short Fuse. Laser Rifle Trooper, codename Flash. Ranger, codename Stalker. Communications Officer, codename Breaker. Machine Gunner, codename Rock and Roll. Counterintelligence, codename Scarlet. Commando, codename Snake Eyes. Each sold separately. G.I. Joe.
Hey everyone, this is a special video for Retro Blasting. We want to dedicate this to Ryan Cutchins. Ryan was a Retro Blasting fan of ours for a long time, and he was a huge G.I. Joe fan. Ryan, this video is dedicated to your memory. We miss you. The concept of the action figure playset is pretty much dead in toy stores today. In fact, you're lucky if a toy line even comes with a vehicle. I know it's a crotchety thing to say, it was better back in my day. But let's face it, the 1980s had the greatest action figure playsets ever. You had castles, mountains, pits, space stations, aircraft carriers, villages, firehouses, towers, fortresses, halls, hills, dromes, sewers, hives, lairs, caves, more dromes, fright zones, and more castles. One of my favorites that I never had the luxury of owning as a child is the G.I. Joe Headquarters Command Center. A lot of collectors put this lower on their list of favorite G.I. Joe playsets because it doesn't have all the action features of the Terrordrome or the massive scale of the USS Flag aircraft carrier. But it is the first all-plastic centerpiece playset in the G.I. Joe line, made in 1983. It amounts to a series of wall panels and floor platforms that you sort of Jenga together.
Jenga. You take a block from the bottom and you put it on top. You take a block from the middle and you put it on top. How you build a tower, you just don't stop. You gotta build that tower putting blocks on top. And it teeters and it totters as you build it all up. It weebles and it wobbles, but you don't give up. You take a block from the bottom and you put it on top. You take a block from the middle and you put it on top. Till someone knocks it over and that's when you stop. But you start all over putting blocks on top.
A lot of people complain about this playset's key shortcomings, and I'm not going to deny it. There are more than a few. The propensity of the slot tabs to break off, the jail cell door hinges that snap off due to a weak design, as well as the dinky wall defense accessories with attachment slots that crack off easily. And when compared with the previously mentioned playset's advantages of massive size and wowing action features, the G.I. Joe Headquarters seems, at a glance, pretty vanilla. But I think those assumptions are wrong. The Headquarters captures that general-purpose military feel of the early Joe toy line. It has a 1980s Army feel, which I really like, and contains everything I would expect a Headquarters to have. A communications tactical station with security monitors, a holding cell for captured enemies, an armory, a helipad, a defense station, and even a motor pool. The Headquarters' first appearance in the comic book involved the Joes installing a portable defense bunker in the mountains where they were holding the captured Cobra Commander under close guard. It was a brilliant move because writer Larry Hama featured the Headquarters almost identically to the look and construction of the toy, giving real context for its function. Sunbow featured the Headquarters as a much more massive, fully realized construct in the early seasons of the animated series, which only resembled the playset in its overall shape. Where the Headquarters stands out from all other playsets is the clear synergy of its design to the rest of the G.I. Joe toys of the time. The Headquarters was engineered to incorporate the vehicles into the function of the playset, a very cool concept in my opinion. there was a place for the Vamp Jeep to pull up as well as a bay for the Mobat tank. In both cases, they served as part of the headquarters' defensive capabilities, as the bunker walls had cannon slots for their armaments to poke through and engage Cobra. The headquarters also had a helipad for the newly released Dragonfly helicopter and or the Skyhawk. I can hear the arguments now. If you're thinking, why design a playset that's dependent on other vehicles in the line to be fully functional, that's stupid. I'd like to remind you that the Terrordrome came with the Firebat, which was the feature every kid wanted, and the USS Flag aircraft carrier didn't come with any vehicles. So it was a ship that was designed to hold jets, and if you didn't have any Sky Striker jets or helicopters, it was just as static as the headquarters, if not more so. Despite the torch I carry for the old headquarters playset, I'm not above admitting it has some weird aspects. Unless it's backed up to a mountain, or you always pretend it has rear walls, Cobra will have an easy time driving around the back with a few tanks and pulverizing the Joes. If the vehicles aren't in their garages and Cobra launches a frontal assault, the headquarters is pretty ill-equipped. A few tiny machine guns and that central cannon are the only things keeping those HISS tanks at bay. This central cannon's design is the weirdest part of the whole fort. I feel sorry for the Joe that gets assigned to this position during a major attack. How would that conversation go?
Excellent! They haven't spotted us. Cobra, attack!
Stalker, assign battle stations. Clutch, Steeler, prep the vehicles for counterattack. Yes, sir. Rock and roll, front and center. Yes, sir. Man the main cannon. Aw, man! You got a problem, mister. Can I peel potatoes instead? No, better yet, I'll take latrine duty. You better explain yourself, soldier. Dude, you're asking me to sit on top of a cannon without any cover out in the open during a firefight with tanks and attack fighters. Not even a flimsy hatch to pull down over me? I'm a sitting duck up there. Who designed this? The best military in the world. Easy for you to say, lightweight. All you do is take phone calls. Why don't you get up there and show me different? I'm, pretty busy here. Yeah, I'll bet. I got a kid cousin who has a radio-controlled dune buggy, but I work for an elite military force that wants me to manually operate a howitzer while Ma Bell over here has Star Trek-style video communications. You're best qualified to man the cannon, rock and roll. Best qualified? Isn't this guy over here a commando and a ninja? Let him do it. He can probably dodge the bullets, too. He'd love it.
He wouldn't love it.
I didn't hear him say he wouldn't.
Didn't hear him say he would.
What's the difference? He never says anything. Or the massive size of the USS Flag aircraft carrier. Homina, 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 homina. It amounts to essentially a bunch of wall panels and floor because it doesn't have the massive size of the Terrordrome or the sheer scale of the USS aircraft carrier. USS aircraft carrier? And likely that's why many playsets in the G.I. Joe line and other action figure lines were standalone. But I can't remember what I was going to say. So, I mean, this is just sweet. Like, this is just, I don't give a This is awesome. It was the great lament for many childhoods of the 1980s. Not enough enemy troops to combat. For some, it was because their parents wouldn't buy them duplicates of figures you already have. For others, it was a calculated choice based on the knowledge that you only received so many toys every year. So when you got the opportunity, you had to make it count, and you didn't want to get something you already had, even though in the back of your mind, more cannon fodder would really enhance your play scenarios. Toy companies wanted you to build your armies too, but they didn't exactly make that easy for you to accomplish.
An entire legion of my best troops awaits them.
Long before the 20th century, you had the pewter and tin soldiers. miniatures that were collected by the children of rich families. In the 20th century, this would become something middle-class kids could collect, and before long we had the ubiquitous plastic army men, which actually date all the way back to 1938, but found their stride in the 50s and 60s as solid green soldiers sold in bags and buckets for pennies on the dollar. But as action figures became larger with G.I. Joe and Mego, it became more cost prohibitive to have multiples, let alone enough to have a massive army. But thanks to the oil crisis of the 1970s, toys went small again, and Kenner's Star Wars led the charge. Now that figures were only $2 and only 4 inches tall, with the collect them all marketing taking hold, kids saw the possibilities, even if their parents didn't. Kids saw hundreds of stormtroopers in the Star Wars trilogy, so when, like me, you only had one basic stormtrooper figure, it was frustrating. The lone stormtrooper had to be an army all by himself, so like a Lazarus man, my stormtrooper died thousands of times, only to be instantly resurrected again and again. As I was able to find some of the other Imperials, this became less problematic. But I always had a dream of having a squad of standard stormtroopers to fight the rebels. Kenner's Star Wars was full of Imperial troops you could collect in large numbers to build your army. But again, it was only if you were willing to give up the chance at a new unique figure to deliberately buy the same guy over and over. And that's assuming your parents could afford it. And if they could, would they let you do it at all? Most of the time they just said, no, you already have that one. Sometimes I'd get lucky and get a few randomly from people at birthdays. On my 5th birthday, I was given a few Emperor's Royal Guards from various people, so I ended up with 4 of them. Not exactly stormtroopers, but I wasn't in a position to complain. I also received 5 Darth Vaders, a character I already had. If only they'd been stormtroopers. That was another problem. When a kid had a big birthday party, the parents of the friends you invited over could have saved themselves the trouble of coming up with a gift if they just bought you basic troops. They couldn't have gone wrong. Unless that kid is a whiny moron or a total punk, no child in his right mind in the 1980s would have complained about having another stormtrooper or Cobra soldier. If you were a kid who was pretty spoiled, then I'm sure you were fine in this department and had tons of soldiers. Or if you were a kid who didn't get the larger toys like the vehicles and playsets and only received action figures, then it seems you had a better chance of receiving multiple enemy troops.
You know, when I was a kid, my parents weren't big on vehicles because I think those were a little bit more expensive, and I was a big fan of the figures anyway. The stormtroopers weren't plentiful, but they weren't hard to find, so all the core characters that I wanted were already out of the way, so why not stock up on stormtroopers when you can? And I did, and I think I had about 6, 7 stormtroopers when I was a kid.
The weird thing about this is toy companies advertise the idea of army building constantly in their commercials and their print ads, showing kids playing with multiple generic baddies against the heroes, but they didn't make it simpler to get them. Just imagine if Kenner or Hasbro had sold stormtroopers and Cobra enemies both as single figures and as 3-packs. Then you could have asked for a 3-pack for a birthday or as a stocking stuffer and had an instant boost to your fascist enemy army. I know hindsight is 20/20, but why they didn't think to do that is staggering. Oh, sure, you had department store special 3-packs for distinct Star Wars figures, and Hasbro said, hey, let's double pack Tomax and Zaymot, or let's sell Sergeant Slaughter's Renegades in a 3-pack. But the figures that really needed en masse purchasing options didn't have them. And it wasn't just Star Wars and G.I. Joe. Most of the toy lines had built-in options for bad guy armies. Buck Rogers had the Draconian Soldier, Chris Star had the Magma Men, Chuck Norris had Evil Ninjas, the Ninja Turtles had a Foot Soldier, Voltron had the Doom Scavenger, Superpowers had the Parademon, you had Cylons, Nockmar Soldiers, Tron Guards, and that Eagle guy from Black Star. Masters of the Universe had Hordak's Horde Trooper, which Mattel said right on the card back was a figure you should buy in large numbers. And Star Wars shamelessly tried to get kids to buy piles of metal micro collection figures as well, with the Build Your Armies promotion in 1982 that sent you 6 micro figures of Rebel and Imperial Hoth troops. The fact that they called this promotion Build Your Armies makes the conspicuous absence of Army Builder multi-packs for the basic stormtroopers kinda inexcusable. But this wasn't just a bad guy's game. There were a few options for building a good guy army as well. In Star Wars, you had the Rebel Soldier and Rebel Commando, as well as a few pilots that could be duplicated. Of course, in Star Wars, you even had aliens that could be turned into armies, like Jawas, Sand People, and Gamorrean Guards. Crystar had a generic Crystal Warrior. Even He-Man had a good guy army option, thanks to the Man-at-Arms figure being without his mustache, giving that figure the ability to be a standard Eternian Guard that you saw sometimes on the series. G.I. Joe had two options for this as well. In the background of the G.I. Joe cartoon, you often saw green army guys in helmets as supporting troops. Well, Grunt could double as that guy if you were so inclined, and if you wanted some variety, you could have even used Zaps alongside Grunts. A Christmas catalog photo from the 80s showing the USS Flag aircraft carrier made Shipwreck a generic figure as well, with 20-some-odd shipwrecks as the Navy crew of the Flag. And some specific bad guys were depicted as cannon fodder on occasion. Take the Mutants and Thundercats. Early on, you see multiple Slythes, Monkeans, and Jackalmen. And there was that one time on G.I. Joe that Lady J fought an army of Storm Shadows?
Dispose of them. They are not worthy of my effort.
Girls experienced army building problems in their toy lines too. When you have 20 Barbies and only one Ken, the imaginary dramas that can unfold are somewhat limited. Although admittedly, a multi-pack of Ken dolls to testosterone boost your Barbie collection is an unsettling idea.
But the 1980s are over, and most of us don't even have our toys anymore. However, whether you have your toys or not, most of us share the same experience. And that's not just an assumption on my part. I asked Retroblasting's 8,000 Facebook followers about their experience with action figure troops and duplicates, and the vast majority who responded never had duplicates of any of them. This comment right here says it all. We always had a saying, you knew the rich kids from the poor kids by counting their stormtroopers. And that shared generational experience is what has brought us to the reality that most toy collectors face today. So many of us dreamed of having armies of bad guys that we can't own just one stormtrooper or Cobra enemy as an adult. We have to own multiples. And some of us have taken it a step further still, and these people are known as army builders. They're not content with a modest handful that might have been possible when we were kids. They want literal armies of action figures. I've even encountered vintage toy dealers that won't sell stormtroopers or Cobra enemies because they're obsessed with building massive armies of bad guys. The result is that some of the most common figures in these toy lines command some of the highest prices. For example, the common Stormtrooper was sold continuously from 1978 to 1985, but despite being one of the most numerous figures in existence, he's a premium figure on the second-hand market because of army builders gobbling them up. Same goes for the Cobra Enemy, the only G.I. Joe figure sold 4 years in a row from 1982 to 1985, but he demands high prices because collectors want 400 of them for display. At least he doesn't carry the added premium of being made from white plastic like the Stormtrooper. Since most white plastic toys run the risk of yellowing over time, there's an extra cost to pay for a minty white trooper, making the Stormtrooper brutal on your wallet. I won't lie and say the idea of army building isn't tempting, but I avoid the bug by limiting myself to between 6 and 8 of the basic troops, and 3 to 4 of the specialty troops like AT-AT drivers or Cobra eels. This also helps me achieve a more varied display. Plus, all it would take is a few army builders' homes going up in flames, and an inordinate number of these figures would be lost in a single go. But I do understand what drives this hobby. It's those memories we can't shake. For me, it was losing Star Wars weapons, so I've obsessively hunted them down again for my action figures. For army builders, it was that inability to conduct massive scale battles that drives them, or an innate love of fascist uniformity. And let's be clear, army building is the collection of mass numbers of generic troops, not to be confused with another collecting phenomenon known as focusing, in which you collect mass numbers of a unique character figure. The act of focusing is better known by another name: hoarding. In recent years, Hasbro has finally figured out the need for troop builder packs. In 2004, they did a big pack of Cobra troops for their G.I. Joe Valor vs. Venom line. In 2008, they sold multi-packs of German soldiers and Cairo assassins for their Indiana Jones figure set. And they have had a few attempts at Star Wars troop builder sets, though the clones were just in-scale posed miniatures. The Evolution set was 3 troops from totally different eras, and the recent Stormtrooper multi-pack was an Amazon exclusive. So here's to army building. A dream we all shared that some of us have actually achieved with staggering success. And just remember, if an army builder's toy collection attacks your toy collection, at best it will be Dunkirk.
Are fucking amazing. Like,
and at worst it'll be Return of the King, where their toy collection is the Army of the Dead, and your toys are the orcs.
Hey, we can build an army of cats.
No.
Come on, Acty. I don't have all day. If you want to come with me, you need to hurry up. My mother moved faster than you.
No, she didn't.
What? You make 10 jerks feel like 100. You half-witted, scruffy-looking...
Nerf herder?
We gotta get back to the past, to the 20th century. Digging through the bubble wrap into your memories. Back was the collector, he's protecting what we find. Relentless heavy metal guns will keep us safe through time. Retro blasting.
This is not a toy.
Just the corners of your mind. Retro blasting. The stuff you love since you were 9. We're blasting into the past. See what thrill still lasts. Retro blasting.
A while back, I received a surprise Star Wars donation from Plastic Galaxy in Oklahoma. The donation was so generous and overwhelming, I made a promise. If Rogue One is good, if I like Rogue One, I will review these toys. After 1985, for those of us that lived it, Star Wars went into hibernation. For a solid 6 years, there was very little to enjoy unless you were able to get your hands on the West End Games role-playing books. There were no new movies, and that meant no new toys. Period. And it sucked. But in 1991, Timothy Zahn released the first novel in the Thrawn trilogy of books, what my generation would adopt as our own episodes 7, 8, and 9. And with that, interest in Star Wars was rekindled, and not just survived, but thrived on this new expanded universe made up solely of books, comics, and a few PC games. In 1995, Kenner, now owned by Hasbro, relaunched the Star Wars action figure line to rabid demand. In the preceding decade, original Star Wars toys had risen in value. I was always hunting for them myself, and there was no eBay or even an internet to assist me. The appeal of Star Wars toys being easy to find in stores again was too great to ignore, and so we thought we'd hedge our bets by buying 2 of everything, so that we'd have a mint-on-card example when these new Star Wars toys inevitably skyrocketed in value. I even got a job at Toys R Us just so I could get the toys as they came out. But these new toys, marketed under the Power of the Force branding yet again, would become one of the key reasons why retroblasting is so staunchly devoted to vintage toys and largely ambivalent to modern toys. Now known as Power of the Force 2 by collectors, the figures were all jacked up on steroids, looking more like wrestlers than the actors in the films. I tried to collect them all, but it wasn't easy with demand being so high. Kenner even re-released the vintage vehicles with new deco and details, but didn't bother to ensure compatibility with the new figures, which were so beefy they often didn't fit in the vintage ships. By 1998, some of the figures were so difficult to find, I gave up for good. Occasionally, I'd grab something key, like Bespin Luke or the re-released A-Wing, since I never had that as a kid. But I largely stayed away until Episode 1 came out, and I went to the first Force Friday at Toys R Us and loaded up on toys for a film I hadn't seen yet, only to learn I'd just invested in action figures for a film I wouldn't like. I didn't make the same mistakes again. Aside from the random Bespin Luke figure, I didn't buy any more modern Star Wars toys. In 2005, I sold off 95% of all the modern toys I'd ever bought over that decade for pennies on the dollar and refocused solely on vintage. So here we are. I've seen Rogue One and I really enjoyed it. I'm a man of my word. So how about these Rogue One toys? Apparently, right around the time I bailed out of modern Star Wars, the figures started to get really posable. But then just a few years ago, Hasbro backed off that direction and returned to the more old-school Kenner style of straight arms, legs, and a turning head, what hardcore collectors refer to as 5 points of articulation or 5 POA. There's a contingent of modern collectors who are quick to denounce old-school 5 POA because they believe that posing is the be-all end-all. But the posability they're talking about is not the usable kind we remember from 80s G.I. Joes. Instead, it's a very gummy-jointed kind of design, where the figures can be contorted 100 ways, but the actual poses aren't all that usable. The results were figures that are more like puzzles than representations of human mobility. Collectors call these super articulated. Take Bespin Han Solo from a few years back. He's got knees that bend, and hips that hinge, and thighs that rotate, and ankles that pivot, but just try getting him in a basic seated position. You have to rotate the legs until his trouser stripes are completely out of alignment. Then try to bend the knees, hoping you don't break them. And the knees don't quite get to 90 degrees. Meanwhile, an old G.I. Joe just sits like a pro. Dude, how can you suck at sitting? What about that classic Han Solo shooting pose? No amount of knobby joints on this figure made that possible either. And few, if any, of the lightsaber-wielding characters gain much benefit from this articulation. The figures are capable of wielding the saber with both hands, but usually not very well. The 5 POA figure is also better at standing, too. The figures for Rogue One are constructed this way as well, and there's a nice synergy with the vintage Kenner figures, since this movie takes place right before the original Star Wars film. The figures are more detailed certainly than the ones we grew up with, but their posability is the same, and their general proportions are closer to the vintage line rather than the beefy He-Man sculpts from the 1990s. Which means the Rogue One action figures are pretty straightforward, and they include little features that we all wished our vintage Star Wars figures had had. Remember how we always wished those holsters molded to their legs would work, and we kinda pulled it off with Hoth Han Solo? Well, with the crew of Rogue One, those sidearms are neatly stowed. And similar to the Kenner line, you have a few figures that barely made it into the background that got representation. As a group, the Rogue One heroes are an interesting crew to look at, and the only stick wielder is Chirrut, which is nice. You've also got your pick of the enemy troops as well. Beyond Darth Vader and Krennic, you get Death Troopers, Scarif Shore Troopers, TIE pilots, ground crew, and if you have the AT-ACT, you get the driver. Hasbro's Rogue One also gives us the best basic Stormtrooper figure since the vintage line. There's no arguing how great this Stormtrooper looks, and he comes with a conversion kit that can turn him into a Sand Trooper if you feel compelled. If you actually want a dedicated Sand Trooper, you have to buy a 2-pack of figures, which is also the only way to get Baze Malbus. And this is where the frustrations begin. Baze is a main hero in the movie and should be available separately. But he's not. To get him, you pay double. But why pay double when you can pay 4 times the price for important characters from Rogue One? Saw Gerrera and his goon? They only come in a $40 4-pack from Hasbro that's so hard to find I eventually just had to resort to eBay to get it. And it's the only way to get the hover tank driver. But don't worry, there's no hover tank available for him to drive. Brilliant, Hasbro. You'll also notice that every basic figure costs $7.99. Yes, inflation is a real thing, but it seems Hasbro felt it necessary to pack every figure with a massive action backpack that shoots projectiles or threads a zip line. When we were kids, the characters and their movie-carried weapon were enough. Let's say the additional accessory allows Hasbro to add $2 more to the total cost. What if Hasbro dropped the dumb accessories and suddenly the figure was only $5.99? At that price, a parent might be willing to buy their kid 2 figures, or maybe 3. And at that moment, the child has a solid foothold in the line and will want to buy more characters to fill out the collection. That's how it worked for us in the 80s. I have to assume it might work that way for kids today. Overall, the new figures for Rogue One are nice representations of the movie characters, with good sculpts and variety. Yes, they're modern toys, but this is a new movie with new characters. And Hasbro is also making a significant number of variation figures, most notably with Jyn Erso. This isn't surprising given that last year Hasbro took a lot of heat for their Force Awakens line sorely lacking in Rey figures, and I guess they didn't want to make the same mistake with Jyn. We've got Jyn in a headscarf, Jyn in a hat and poncho, Jyn in Imperial disguise, and even Jyn with no headscarf and sandy boots. This version comes with the AT-ACT, which was a scene that was prominently in the trailer, but didn't actually make it into the real movie. In fact, both this Jyn and the R2 droid that come with the AT-ACT weren't in the final film. You'd think Hasbro would have used those 2 figure slots for characters that matter, like, I don't know, Cassian in Imperial disguise, or a rebel soldier would have been nice, or hell, Blue Leader. The funny part is this AT-ACT Jyn Erso isn't actually accurate to that deleted scene. The figure is wearing a jacket under her vest. This jacket isn't with her on Scarif at the end of the film, just the vest. But fear not, because Hasbro is still making those super articulated figures and selling them at Walmart. And among them is, yes, a Jyn Erso sans jacket, complete with a multi-part sniper rifle and her vest. If I had to pick a fail from all of this Erso-ness, it would have to be the one with the hat and goggles. She cannot move one arm thanks to the poncho and air bottle on her belt, and she doesn't stand all that well either. Cassian gets 2 basic figures, one with his coat and one with his jacket. He also has a super articulated version at Walmart, also in the jacket. You can effectively get Cassian in his jacket 3 ways, either with those bendy limbs from Walmart, or the old school style figure which is packed both in a Toys R Us exclusive 2-pack with a Stormtrooper and with the U-Wing fighter vehicle. Those latter 2 are the exact same figure. Again, another missed opportunity to give buyers a different character, like Blue Leader. But any toy company would be in a tough spot with Rogue One. Almost every figure is an effigy of death. Jyn dies, Cass dies, Baze dies, Bodhi dies, Chirrut dies, K2 dies, Krennic dies, Blue Leader dies. But even if Blue Leader had lived, it wouldn't make a difference because there'd be no X-Wing for him to fly. And this is where the Rogue One line really suffers from the modern Hasbro strategy. You have this line of decent-looking figures, but only 3 vehicles to choose from. All of them are undersized, overpriced, and right here in the studio.
It's a guy I know. He's opening up a brand new luxury class for you. Okay, good.
Watch this. I've taught Acti a trick. Acti, light it up. Fetch.
He's as clumsy as he is stupid.
We gotta get back to the past, to the 20th century. Digging through the bubble wrap into your memories. Back was the collector, he's protecting what we find. Relentless heavy metal guns keep us safe through time. Retro blasting.
This is not a toy.
Just the corners of your mind. Retro blasting. The stuff you love since you were 9. We're blasting into the past. To see what brings still lies. Retro blasting.
Probably because it's one of my favorite things.
The entire reason Kenner Toys made Star Wars figures 3 3/4 inches tall in 1978 was directly related to their need to fit the figures in vehicles. Star Wars was just as much about vehicles as it was about characters in Kenner's mind, and if they'd stuck with the 12-inch tall action figure, they'd never be able to sell a Millennium Falcon that was 5 feet wide. After Hasbro relaunched Star Wars toys in 1995, the vehicles produced were initially re-releases of the vintage ships, but they soon branched out and expanded the fleet with vehicles we never got in the vintage series, such as the TIE Bomber, the T-16 Skyhopper, and a completely redesigned Darth Vader TIE Fighter. It was clear from the beginning of the relaunched line that Hasbro had little to no interest in playsets, but complaints were few because the vehicle lineup was so impressive. These days, Hasbro has all but abandoned vehicles as well, and when they do get around to making vehicles, they're always terminally overpriced, wincingly undersized, and too few. The Rogue One line has exactly 3 vehicles to choose from. Seth Hastings at Plastic Galaxy sent me the U-Wing fighter in the mystery box. It's the main transport for the characters in the first half of the movie, but immediately you can see there's a problem with the scale. The U-Wing fighter is way too small. In the film, the vehicle is not literally a fighter. Rather, it's more of a troop dropship, sort of the Star Wars equivalent of a Black Hawk helicopter. But this toy is downsized considerably, and only holds 1 figure via a chintzy elastic strap when it should be a cockpit for 2. The underbelly where the troops should go, while already far too small, is home to a recessed Nerf dart cannon rather than any area for figures. Yes, the ship looks nice as a model, and the wing swing feature is well engineered, but the toy is too small and flimsy for a vehicle that was in essence the Millennium Falcon of this movie. The vintage Falcon was a great people mover for us as kids, and it's a shame that Rogue One, which is all about a team of commandos, doesn't have a vehicle that carries them all. Given that Hasbro is only making 3 vehicles for this line, there's no excuse for making this toy so pointless, especially when LEGO is able to realize the ship exactly as it was shown. I can't overemphasize how undersized the vehicle is. It isn't much larger than the TIE Striker, but at least the TIE Striker is pretty much the right size for the TIE Fighter toys we've been familiar with since 1978. While it looks like a good and plenty with half a TIE Interceptor's wings, it's a sturdy little vehicle. The cockpit is adequate with a rugged canopy. The wings are a bit floppy, and the Striker has a useless swing lift feature, operated by awkwardly folding the wings up one at a time. There's no single button activation like the vintage X-Wing. The film itself lacks an iconic visual of the TIE Strikers moving their wings into attack position. So unlike the shot of the X-Wings locking their S-foils that we loved in the original film, this feature on the TIE Striker is devoid of that familiarity, and the release lever serves only to smash your fingers if you're not careful. Ow. The TIE Striker also has a Nerf cannon with green darts, because Hasbro is addicted to Nerf, and they're chasing that dragon with fervor. Because that's what I like hanging off the wings of my TIE Fighter. Nerf darts. I also find it odd that a movie set mere hours before the original Star Wars gets TIE Fighters that are completely redesigned, while The Force Awakens, set 30 years after Return of the Jedi, just has your basic TIE Fighters with beefier wing connectors. Yes, I know they say the Strikers are for atmospheric operations, but let's get real. If the ties in Force Awakens are doing this kind of stuff, wouldn't it have made more sense to have the reinforced basic ties be the atmospheric ties in Rogue One as Scarif specials, and have the TIE Strikers show up in Force Awakens, where they could have really made a visual impact as the evolved TIE Interceptor? When it comes to Rogue One vehicles, the most controversial is the AT-ACT. According to everything I've read, the AT-ACT is supposed to be larger than the AT-ATs from The Empire Strikes Back. But what Hasbro has delivered to us is the smallest walker they've ever made, at the highest price they've ever demanded. You'll hear people saying the AT-ACT is the same size as the Vintage, but that's extremely deceptive. At a glance, it might look the same size, but it isn't. And Hasbro has condemned this toy firmly in scale purgatory. The Vintage AT-AT could hold 2 drivers in the cockpit. The AT-ACT, just 1, because the head isn't the same width, and a Nerf cannon magazine occupies the rest of the space. In the middle of the AT-ACT is a large orange rectangle, which we learn through this toy is a cargo pod of sorts, theoretically capable of holding construction equipment or troops. We pull the pod out of the vehicle and open it up, and not even Jyn Erso can stand up in it. They have to stand on the open edges, and only with the pod out of the way can figures stand upright in the belly of the AT-ACT, provided you remember to lift the courtesy flaps for their heads. It's the most ridiculous design decision I've ever seen. Meanwhile, the Vintage AT-AT has no issues holding a horde of troops in its cargo bay, fully standing and capable of being enclosed for transport. The AT-ACT's party trick is that it's the first figure-scale, fully automated walker in Star Wars toy history. Yes, I know, in the 80s we had the MPC Structors wind-up AT-AT, and the Galoob Action Fleet had a corded electronic walking AT-AT in the 90s, but these were miniature. The AT-ACT has an app you can download for free to connect your smartphone to the walker via Bluetooth. Then you can turn the head, fire the red LED cannons, lumber the walker forward, and fire Nerf darts. All with the accompanying sound effects. And all of this gimmickry is kinda cool, but it comes at a price.
Just put your hand sandwich on the ground. Walk your AT-ACT
Yes,
over to it.
Hasbro wants $300 for this thing, but retailers aren't having it. I found this one a few days before Christmas at a Walmart for 50% off. And the toy had only been available a few days across the country at that point. If you think the deep discount so soon after release makes no sense, the idea to charge $300 for something this small with so little functionality makes even less sense. As it is, the legs are part of the automation and cannot be posed independently. The Nerf cannon is extremely weak, sort of spitting rather than rocketing, which is bizarre given that the TIE Striker and U-Wing cannons are downright dangerous. And even the Rogue One branded Nerf guns have superior velocity and range. But the big mystery is the unusable scale of the thing. See, Rogue One isn't where this behavior started. Last year for The Force Awakens, Hasbro made a new Millennium Falcon and charged $200 for it. It had a huge, stupid Nerf cannon, but was not big enough for the figures to stand up in the back when the ship was closed. The details inside the interior were scaled down too, making the figures look like giants in a Lilliputian world. As it is, it's just big enough to be expensive, but just small enough to be annoying. The mind reels. Consider The Force Awakens was the biggest movie in box office history, and the demand was there for the toys in spades. I'm pretty sure Hasbro could have sold whatever they wanted at whatever price was necessary. As you know, I'm not a modern collector, but anytime I visit a store, I go to the toy aisle. And Hasbro used to have Moxie. Now they're cheaping out while demanding stupid prices. To try and understand this, I reached out to Jake Stevens, founder of FromForlomToZuckus.com, and asked him why Hasbro has been holding back on scaling the vehicles to a size that is at least the vintage equivalent. Jake told me Hasbro said it has been trying to fight rising production and labor costs the past few years. I would think if you're trying to fight production costs and labor costs, the last thing you would do is develop a technologically complex toy from scratch, as well as the proprietary software to go with it. Why didn't they just dust off the vintage version and sell it again? It's not like they haven't done it before, and it would have saved them all that time and money they took to develop this new toy. Just change the side guns, remove the chin guns, and make the middle section orange. Boom, instant toy-friendly AT-ACT, and I bet it wouldn't have been $300. Or if they were insistent on making a new toy, and they already knew it was going to be in the triple-digit price range, just make it big enough for the figures to work with properly, and tag it at $329.99 or whatever. Go big or go home! A few years ago, Hasbro really pushed the envelope with the Star Wars brand. They got away from the vintage vehicle remakes of the 90s and went all out with brand new versions of many classic trilogy vehicles. The X-Wing got bigger, the TIE's wings got bigger, Slave One got bigger, the Scout Walker got taller, the Millennium Falcon was now the size of a coffee table, the Snowspeeder got smaller, but that's because the vintage one was actually slightly oversized. And they made the AT-AT the size of a collie. Hasbro claims they can't make big vehicles like this anymore because of the retail prices that would be so high they wouldn't fly with buyers. They claim this Falcon would cost $500 at retail today. But when Hasbro's pushing a $300 toy out into the marketplace and collectors are willing to spend $400 for these legacy Falcons secondhand, Hasbro's explanation as to why they're pushing out $50 undersized U-Wing fighters and $200 undersized Millennium Falcons doesn't hold a lot of water. The short of it is that Hasbro used to take real risks with the Star Wars license. Even as someone who didn't collect modern, I will freely admit Hasbro demonstrated a lot of ambition there for a few years. But the elephant in the room with this video is modern Star Wars. Is it worth collecting? The answer is complicated. Since 1995, we've had an endless stream of Hasbro Star Wars products that by and large has just continued to eat its own tail. Hasbro Star Wars habitually consumes itself on a cyclical basis. Don't believe me? If you go over to JediBusiness.com, you'll see 18 different Farm Boy Luke Skywalkers since